Hello and welcome back to Brain Academy. In today's episode, episode 4, we're going to be going over some more advanced scripting, covering how to damage the player, the various pickups we're going to have in our game, checkpoints, and enemies. So as you can see here, we've got everything up and running in the current build here, and I'm going to walk you guys through exactly how we can build each of these assets. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into the project and get started.
So first we're going to start with the health tracker script, which keeps track of how much health the player will have. So we'll need a couple of variables, so we'll have the current health and the max health written down. And then also we'll make a property for the current health so that it keeps isolated, that you can only set it through this script, so that you don't set it somewhere else. Then we're going to add the player controller as a reference, a Boolean variable that will check if damage was taken, because we do have invincibility mode for a couple of split seconds, so if you're invincible, you won't be able to take more damage. So in Awake, we'll set up the current health to be the max health, so that when you spawn in, you always have the max health. We'll get the player controller component from the object. Then we'll set up the take damage script, so if you can take damage, then subtract it from your current health. And then also check for death, which then in check for death, it'll return a Boolean, which we'll use later. And then if the current health is less than or equal to 0, then that means you died. So then return true, and then return false outside of that. Now we're going to go into the damage script, where we're going to have a variable for the amount of damage it'll give you. So if you're falling off the cliff, you'd make it the max health, or if it's just a robot or something else, you'd just make it 1 damage. And then we're going to use the function onEnterTrigger, which allows you to check for a collision between one object and then an object that has a trigger component of a collider. And then, so from the other object, we're going to get the health component from it. And then we're going to check if it actually had one. If you hit the damage, but it wasn't actually the player with the health script, then the player shouldn't take any damage. That's why we're checking if it's null. And then if it isn't null, then we want to call the take damage script, which we just wrote in the other method. So before we can start doing the checkpoint and the checkpoint tracker script, we have to add something to the player controller, which will allow us to teleport the player into a different position. So to do that, we have to disable the char controller. The char controller has this feature where it can only move with the .move, but that also checks for collisions, and we want to teleport the player, so we actually have to disable it and then enable it as soon as we change the position with the transfer.position equals the point that you pass through it. And the last thing we have to add is resetting the movement, so it doesn't have any previous forces applied to the player, in case you fall off the cliff and then gravity's just going to keep pushing you down. So now we're going to head over to the checkpoint script, and this is going to go on the game objects that are the checkpoints, so the spawn points in when you die. And so we're going to have a couple of values. This also will be used as an endpoint for when you get to the end of the level, which will allow you to load the next scene. So we're gonna have a toggle on to see if it's gonna be that load scene. And then if it's toggled on, then we're gonna also pass in the name of the level we wanna load. Other than that, we're gonna make another trigger. And then when it enters the trigger, we're gonna get the checkpoint tracker off the player, if it's the player. So we're gonna check if the checkpoint tracker is not null, and if the current checkpoint tracker isn't this point, that means you walked into a new checkpoint, and the thing that walked in was the player, and we're gonna set it to be that. And then if you want it to load to the next scene, then we're gonna use scene manager.load scene, and then pass in that string that we made. And note that you need the scene manager imported with the using statement at the top. Next, we're gonna move to the checkpoint tracker, where we already had a reference to the current checkpoint, just so that the code wouldn't error out. And then we're gonna add references to the transform of the starting point. So when you first load into the game, there's gonna be a certain point where in case you don't pass a checkpoint, it'll still be in there. It actually knows where to spawn. And we're also gonna add a reference to a player controller and the health tracker. On awake, we're gonna grab the health tracker and the player. And then we're gonna fill in the respawn. So if the current checkpoint is null, so that you never walk through a checkpoint, then teleport the player to the starting checkpoint. Else put in the teleport to the current checkpoint position. And we will also have to then set the current health to the max health because you died and you need to respawn with all your health back. Oh, and we forgot to make a public property for the max health, so we'll go back to the health tracker and then make it return the max health as a property. We're gonna move on to the pickups, but first we're gonna need to keep track of all our coins. This is very similar to the health tracker, minus the death and respawning. The one difference is we're gonna have a static coin tracker, and this way we can access that instance on the player without having a reference to the player for each of the coins, so when they boot up, we know the total amounts of coins are in. We're also gonna have a variable for the total amount of coins, and also the current coins the player's collected. And then we're gonna add a property for the current coins just to keep that track. And then in awake, we're gonna have the instance set to this so that when it first boots up, we know what instance references. And then in add to total coins, we're just gonna do total coins plus equals the amount that's passed through. And now onto the pickup script. We're gonna make a new enum called pickup type, which is gonna have the following coin and health. You can make whatever you want, matters what pickups you would like. And then in the serialized fields, we're gonna include the pickup type and then how much that single pickup amount value is. And we're gonna add the health tracker and the coin tracker to it. And then on start, we're gonna set the coin tracker to the coin tracker.instance, that static variable we made. And then if the pickup is gonna be equal to the type of coin, then we want it to add that total amount to the coin tracker so that on the top of the HUD, you know how many coins are in the level. And then we're also gonna do onEnter trigger, check if the game object that we're hitting has the tag of player. And then if it does, we would make a switch statement. So this is gonna have one of these results. And we're gonna look at the pickup type of the object that we have. And then if it's a coin pickup, then it'll call the coin pickup method. and then if it's health pickup, it'll call the health pickup method. In the coin pickup method, all we're going to do is set the coin tracker to be the current coins plus the amount that is on that coin, and then destroy that game object so that it's not in the scene anymore. And then for the health tracker, it's a bit more complicated. We got to check if your current health is less than the max health. If it's greater than, you're not going to pick up the coin, and it's still going to stay in the scene. And then we're going to add that amount. And make sure we do mathf.clamp so that the value, so you can't have more than your max health, basically is what we're doing there. And then we're going to destroy the game object so that you can't just get infinite lives. And just so that you can see it working, we're going to add a debug.log saying that you already have max health. And that's it for the pickups. Now we're going to move on to the enemy controller. And here we are in the enemy controller, and the first thing we're going to do is add a enum, which will be the direction. We'll have the right and left values. This will determine which way the enemy is going to be heading towards. Next, we're going to add some inspector serialized values. The first one's going to be the base speed, which is going to be the base horizontal speed. This is how fast the enemy is going to move in one direction. And then the next value we're going to add is the start direction. So this is the direction they first start heading in. And by default, I'm going to put down direction.left. The next thing we're going to add is two booleans. The first one's going to be grounded, which is going to determine if the enemy is currently on the ground or not. And the next one is if they're alive, which is if you shoot them with the hookshot, they will die. So it's going to be set to true on start. The next thing we're going to add is the current direction, so this is just to keep track of which direction they're in. We're going to add a rigid body component reference, and as well as an animator component reference. And then we're going to go to the top and add require component, so just in case the designers or whoever else is working in the project just needs to add this one script, and they'll have all the other components needed. So we'll add the animator and the rigid body to the top. Next, we're going to go to the awake function and then get the component of the rigid body, so we have a reference. We're going to set the current direction to be the start direction, and we're also going to get the reference to the animator component. So now we're going to get to the detecting if they're on the ground or not, the enemies, so that they move. And the first thing we have to keep note of is that when the reason why we have on collision stay, which we're going to start coding in, is the fact that when the enemy moves, it might jump a bit, which causes them to call on collision exit, but they're still technically grounded. So what we're going to do is we're going to check if they're not grounded, and if they're colliding with something that's called ground, we're going to set the grounded to be equal to true, just to make sure that if they jump, it won't cause any mistakes. Sorry, grounded, not grounded. So on collision stay means while an object is still in collision with it, it will be called every frame. So now we're going to move on to on collision exit, which is different from on collision stay because it's called the last frame an object's in collision. So here we're going to check if the object is grounded, and if the collision tag is equal to ground, then we will set grounded to false. So now we're going to move on to on collision enter, and this is called at the first frame when there's a collision detected rather than the last frame like on collision exit. So here we're going to check the collision's first contact point on the y-axis and if it's greater than the enemy's y position. So that means it hit something, and all we're going to do is flip the direction. This is just a fancy, quick way of writing it. So basically, it's an else-if statement, the current direction equal to direction left is the same. It's the Boolean, and then as you can see, it's the same thing. And then the first value put after the question mark is going to be what comes in the if, so if that statement's true. And because we have the current direction equals, it'll just make the current direction equal direction right. And then the second value is the else, so if that statement's false. And then it'll set the current direction to equal direction left. So now we're going to move on to the def function, and we're going to set the Boolean alive to false. We're going to set an animation trigger to play the animation death. And then finally, we're going to get the component of the sphere collider and turn that off so that you can't cause the enemy to die again. And don't forget to save. You don't want to lose any of your work.
Alright, so here we can see we're back in the scene we set up in the previous episodes. I've added a few things here, so I've added this structure off towards the side just by dragging in some of the prefabs that we've made. We're going to set the enemies up over there, so if you want to make something similar, go right ahead. But the first thing we're going to cover is damaging our player. So Agusha has already walked you through how to write these scripts. Now we just need to set it up. So the first thing you're going to need is the health tracker on the player. So you can just grab the script and drag it right on. You can see in here you have places for a particle system and for text. We don't need to worry about that right now. We're going to cover that later. And then there are spaces for current health and maximum health, which is going to set the value, how many hits your character can take. So to set up a damage zone, we're going to create a cube. So I'm just going to right click on the hierarchy over here and select cube, drag it into the scene, line it up with the player, make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to walk into, and then go to the box collider, and where it says is trigger, you want to turn that on. So that's going to make it so that we don't collide with it, but we can walk through it. And then go to your scripts and drag the damage script onto it. I'm just going to leave the amount at 1, and as you can see, when the player walks through, he takes damage as evident by this flashing, blinking shader that Chris will teach you how to make later. And over here you can see the health ticks down each time I walk through it, but we're getting an error down at the bottom, and that's because there's no checkpoint system hooked up yet. So when you die, when you reach 0 health, it looks for a checkpoint to send you back to, but because we haven't set that up yet, we're throwing an error. So we're going to go ahead and do that next. Alright, so to set up the checkpoint, we're going to go into Scene Assets, 3D Assets, Platforms. And we're going to grab the platform _ checkpoint. Ignore the magenta once again. And after you drag it into the scene, you can see the textures for it are already properly applied. And we're just going to line it up under the character here. And then we're going to open it up and we're going to go to the game object inside of it. We're going to add a mesh collider. And we're going to tick on convex, and this is going to make a collider that's more in line with the shape of the object. So you can walk on it and the player collides with it properly. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go up a layer to platform _ checkpoint, and we're going to add a capsule collider. And we're going to line that up above the bottom portion of the checkpoint. And this is where the player will walk through to activate the checkpoint. So make it roughly the same size as the character so it's easy to hit, and just line it up above the platform. And check on is trigger so you can't collide with it, but the script will know when you walk through it. and then throw on the checkpoint script. And we'll cover what these two things do later, but right now we'll just leave them off. And then go onto the main player and add in the checkpoint tracker script and drag in the platform checkpoint as the start checkpoint. So now if we go in and test this, you can see nothing's happened yet, but if we walk through this box here 3 times, we will die and we'll respawn on the checkpoint. Alright, so now we're going to just spruce up this damage volume a little bit. We're going to go into our materials folder, we're going to create a material, and we'll just call it damage zone. And if we go in here where it says surface type and change it to transparent, and then in blending mode make it additive, you can see the material gets a little bit transparent here. You can see through it, and it's just sort of adding color on top of the background. If we turn on emission down here, change it to red, we have a glowing red zone that will damage the player. So if you want to make hazards out of these, feel free to do so. We're just going to create a large kind of net under the playing area, so if you fall off, you land in this, and we're going to change the amount of damage on this to 3, so it immediately kills the player if they fall into it. And we're just going to test things here. We're going to jump off the side and collide with this and respawn. So everything here is working properly, so we can move on to creating the pickups next. Alright, so now that we have the checkpoints and the damage working properly, we're going to move on to the pickups. So we have 2 pickups in our game. There are health pickups, the hearts here, and coins, which are going to be collectibles, essentially points. So if we go in here, we can see the coin model. And if we go up onto the sidebar here, you can see I've changed the scale factor down to pretty much a quarter. And the reason I've done this is if you change that back to 1, hit apply, and drag it in, you can see it's much bigger than it should be. So it's easier to shrink it down here before importing it. So you have to do less scaling once it's actually in the scene. So I'm going to drag it in here, move it so that it's on the same plane as our player, shrink it down a bit, and just sort of line it up in a place where it'd be pick-upable. Alright, so now we're going to have to apply the texture to this. So we're going to head over to the materials folder, into pickups. So here's the material here. This is a shader that Chris has made for us. He'll teach you how to make it later on. Just drag it onto the coin. You can see it's applied here. It's got a nice kind of gold sheen to it. And then we're going to head back out to the scripts folder, and we're going to add this pickup script onto the gold coin. So just drag it on there, and you can see it has this drop-down menu in pickup type where you can select between health and coin. We're going to set it to coin, and we're just going to keep the amount at 1. Then we're going to also want to add in a few things so this actually functions properly. The first thing is a sphere collider. So we want this to be roughly the same size as the coin so that when the player walks through it, they pick it up. So just expand it out a little bit, and you can center it a little bit better if you want to. So now if we go to play on the player, you can see we're missing the coin tracker, which is right here. So we're going to drag that on. Once again, ignoring the particle system and the text. And if we hit play and jump to try and pick up this coin, you can see we're going to have a little bit of an issue. And that is because the collider on the sphere collider is still not is trigger. So we're going to turn it to is trigger, and then we'll be able to pick it up properly. And you're going to want to also make sure that the player is tagged player. Otherwise, the script won't know what to do when you collide with it. So there we go. We have the coin working properly. But I think we can probably spruce this up a little bit, make it a little bit nicer. So we're going to add an animator on here. And we're going to add some animations so that this pops a little bit more. So we're going to make it spin. So there's a few things that go into doing this. We've already covered how to set up animation trees, but we haven't looked at all at creating animations in Unity. And as you can see, we have a similar thing for the heart, and I'm just going to teach you how to do that for the coins. So we're going to make a controller called coins, And then we're going to go up to the window, we're going to go to animation, and we're going to open animation rather than the animator. This popped up off screen. I'm going to drag it in here. So this is for creating animations just straight in Unity. I'm going to set it up down at the bottom here. So if we click create here, it's going to ask us to name the animation. We'll name it coin rotation, similar to the heart one. And we get a dope sheet here. So this is where we can set up keyframes. If you're familiar at all with animation, this will look familiar to you. If you're not, this is all really simple stuff. So we can add a property, we're going to add rotation, and if we expand it, we can see we have the X, the Y, and the Z, and these correspond to the transform on the coin. So really simple animation, we're going to go to the last frame, set it to 359.9, so that will do a full rotation of the coin. But if you look closely, you can see it's slowing down at the beginning and the end, and that's because the curve here it's curving, and we want it to be linear. So what we're going to want to do is select the endpoints of the curve, and just right-click. We're going to want to right-click and set the tangents both to linear, and then do the same thing up at the top. So what this is going to do, it's going to make the animation loop more seamlessly. It's not going to slow down at the start or the end of the animation. So you can see it spinning there. It's spinning quite fast. So we'll slow that down once we get into the animation tree. So it's created an extra controller here, this gold coin V3. We can just delete that. We'll use the one we created. And we'll just go back to the coin, and we'll drag that animator into there, and then we'll open up the tree and drag the coin rotation on there. It will instantly link up, and we're going to slow it down to 0.25 so it spins slower. And if we go in here and play, you can see the coin spinning there a little bit nicer, and when you pick it up it disappears. So that's the coin setup, and we're going to do the same thing now for the heart. So 3D assets, pickups, heart, and you can see it here. We'll drag it in. It's currently missing its material, so we're gonna just drag the heart material on there. Another shader made by Chris, and we'll expand it out here, shrink it down to 4. And this is gonna go very similar to how the coin was set up. So we're gonna go through the same process of adding those components on. We're gonna add the pickup script. This time we're gonna change it from coin to heart, and we still want it to just restore 1 health at the moment. We're going to add an animator, and we already have these animations built out, so all we have to do is drag in the heart controller here, and then open this up, and you can see I've slowed it down already, so that should work fine. And then we'll add the sphere collider. And remember to set it to is trigger, and we have it all set up. So now if we play and we run through it, it's not going to do anything, and you can see it gives you this little message at the bottom that the player already has max health. But if we take damage and pick it up, then we actually pick it up and it will restore the health to us. So that covers everything for the pickups. Next we're going to create the enemies. Alright, so setting up the enemies, we're going to want a fairly wide spot to place them because they're going to move back and forth. So we're going to move over here. First, we're just going to organize our hierarchy over here. It's getting a little cluttered with some of the new things we've added. So we'll put the pickups in a pickup game object. We'll make a game object folder for the damage volumes and actually name these 2 cubes to be damage zones so we actually know what they are. It's important to, as you add more and more things to the scene, just to keep as organized as possible so you don't end up with random cubes that you aren't sure what they are supposed to be. Alright, so we got a nice organized hierarchy, so now we can focus on getting the enemies up and running. So we're going to go scene assets, 3D assets, characters, and we're going to add this enemy bot animated here. So we drag it in, you can see it's missing some of its textures, so we're going to want to go to materials and just add those on there. When you open up the prefab up here at the top, you'll see a familiar structure. similar to the player. And we're going to open the base and just drag the materials into these 2 slots. So there we go, got all the textures applied. We're going to rotate them, not using the base, but using the highest up part of the structure here. And we're going to rotate it so it's facing one direction, doesn't really matter which way it's facing. And now we're going to have to make the animation tree for it. So similar to the player, we're going to have a few animations here. So similar to the player, we're going to have to extract some animations from the actual model. So head into 3D Assets Characters, go up to the Animation tab on the enemy bot, and you can see I've already extracted the 2 animations here, the walking animation and the death animation. So you can see them in the preview window down here. This will be a much simpler tree because we're only going between 2 animations here. But we'll go back to Scene Assets Animation, right-click, create a new animation controller. We'll call it Enemy Controller. And we'll head into building the tree. So you'll get the empty tree. You're going to want to go back to the 3D Assets, Characters, Enemy Bot, and click on this arrow here to extend it. And we'll just drag in the walking and the death animations. So we want it to immediately go into the walking, so that's easy. And then we'll just make a new trigger called death and make a transition with that as its condition. And we're going to turn off exit time because we want him to die as soon as he's hit by anything. And this will play walking until the character dies. And it's as simple as that. We have the animations good to go. So we can just apply that onto the actual enemy bot we have in the scene. We hit play and we'll see him, if we switch to scene, just kind of moving in place, saw blades going, eye looking around. And now we're going to add on the enemy controller. And when we try and do that, we can see it's missing a component because it needs a box collider in order to work. So we're going to add the box collider first. And we'll line this guy up a little bit more, just set him to 90 degrees. Make sure that box collider is fitting nicely on top of him and moving along the top of the ground, just like that. And now we can actually add the script. So we're going to type in enemy controller and add it. It's going to add on this rigid body because it needs it, and it says in the script to just add it on whenever you add the script to an object. And we're going to need to change some things inside the actual rigid body. So if you can see what's happening right here, he's sort of just tumbling around, and that's because the script is pushing him, but there's nothing that's keeping him from rotating. So we want to freeze all of the rotations on the rigid body, and this is just going to make him move back and forth seamlessly. So we can see him here. He's going to just move in a direction until he hits anything, and then he's going to bounce back in the other direction. So he's not damaging the player, and that is because there's currently nothing on this side script object that is telling him to damage anything. So we're going to add the damage script, and we're going to add a second collider, and this one's going to be a sphere collider. And we want this one to be a little bit larger than the actual radius. So we'll line it up near the middle and expand it out a little bit. Just kind of go up to maybe 1 or 0.9. And this is the radius that is going to detect whether or not it's going to damage something. And we want to make sure we set it to is trigger as well. So if we go over here, you can see he's sort of gliding along the ground and bouncing. That's because I've forgotten to set it to is trigger. So he's moving along the sphere collider instead of his box collider. So if we click on him over on the sidebar, and we head down to the sphere collider and turn that from what it is currently, which is it's not is trigger, onto is trigger, he'll drop back down and he'll start damaging the player. And then eventually the player will die if he gets hit enough. And you can see we get a message that says that the player has respawned. So the enemy bot is pretty much set up at this point, along with the rest of the prefabs. We're just going to rename it. I'm going to name it Doomba. And we'll just add these down into the prefabs folder. So I'm going to make another folder, just call it pickups to keep things organized. And we're just going to drag down the gold coin. I'm just going to rename that to coin. And the heart. It's going to give you the option for original or variant. We're going to want this to be original. And I've accidentally added the heart here twice, so we can just delete these. And you can see when I delete the prefab, the heart goes red, and that means that your prefab is missing. So it doesn't have any data to draw upon, so I'm just going to delete both of them, drag it back in, and it turns blue again. And then we'll just drag in the Doomba, another original prefab, and we can make sure when we do this that anything that the Doomba is set upon is tagged ground. You can add this tag by just opening the tag menu, going down to add tag, and then hitting this plus sign, and then just type it in there and hit save. I'm not going to do that because we already have it. So anything that's tagged ground, they'll move upon, bounce off of anything else they collide upon. They'll go right off edges. So if you want, you can have them spawn and just run right off an edge. And here you can see what happens when it's on something that isn't tagged. So if you're ever having problems with the enemies, just make sure you double check to see that the ground is tagged. And I'm going to check this as is triggered just before I save this as a prefab. And you can overwrite pre-existing prefabs with this button at the top. So we have it all set up. You can see that saved in the actual prefab down in the project folder. So I'll save out this checkpoint as well. Just rename it checkpoint and drag it down to the bottom. And now that we're done with most of the things in here, we're just going to go over this load new level part of this script. So what this is going to allow us to do is that at the end of a level, when you step on the checkpoint, instead of it saving your location, it can bring you to a new scene. So I'm just going to create a new scene here. I'll save it as test. And if we go back to that checkpoint, I'm going to move the player off it first so it doesn't happen immediately. Tag that and just type in the name of the scene we want it to go, so test in this case. Then we walk onto it. And it hasn't worked here is because these scenes aren't added to the build order. So we go to File, Build Settings, and we get this little box here and you can just drag scenes up into this. So this is the order that things will be built when they're when you go to build the actual game. We'll cover that in the last episode, but as you can see, it works now. And I'm just going to delete this because we don't need it. And just clean this out. And now we have all of the objects that we scripted and set up in this episode. Alright, so that is everything for episode 4. We've gone over making the damage volumes, the checkpoints, our 2 pickups, and the enemy robots. So next episode, we're going to be covering our advanced mechanic, which is a hookshot. We're going to be going over setting up the new animations for that, the interactions it will have with the environment and the enemies, and going over how to script a more complex mechanic than anything we've done so far. So for now, you can check out the links in the description. You can play around with the things we've just set up, begin building out a basic level for yourself, and we will see you next time here on Brain Academy. Thanks for watching.